Nobody in Caldwell Crossing talked about Harley Thornwell the way they talked about other men. They didn't swap stories about him over dinner or argue about his character at the feed store. They simply went quiet. A particular kind of quiet, the sort that falls over a room when someone mentions a thing that everyone agrees is better left alone. His property sat at the far edge of town, separated from the nearest neighbor by nearly 2 miles of dry brush and red clay road. The house itself was large, well-built, and almost entirely dark at night. People said he preferred it that way. People said a lot of things about Harley Thornwell. What was certain was this: in 11 years, not a single person in Caldwell Crossing had knocked on that door and been glad they did. Which made what Inez Alderton did on the night of October 3rd all the more remarkable. She hadn't planned it. That was the truth she would turn over in her mind for a long time afterward. That none of it was planned. Not the running, not the rain, and certainly not the house. The argument with her father had begun at supper, the way most things in the Alderton household began. Quietly, then all at once. Gerald Alderton had set down his fork with a particular kind of deliberateness that Inez had learned to dread over 23 years of living under his roof. It meant he had already decided something. It meant the conversation was not a conversation at all, but an announcement dressed up to look like one. "Hector Baines has made an offer," her father said. "A fair one. I've accepted." Inez had gone still. Hector Baines was 51 years old. He owned the largest cattle operation in the county and smiled at women the way a man smiles at land he's already purchased. She had spoken to him exactly 4 times in her life, and each time she had walked away feeling smaller than when she'd started. "You accepted," she repeated. "The wedding will be in the spring." Gerald picked his fork back up. "You'll want to start on a dress." She had sat there for a long moment, hands folded in her lap, the way her mother had taught her. Then she pushed back her chair, walked to her room, and began to pack a bag. Not everything, just what she could carry. She was out the back door before her father finished his coffee. The rain found her about a mile out of town. It came sideways, the way October rain in that part of Texas had a habit of doing. It cold and immediate and entirely without mercy. Inez pulled her coat tighter and kept walking. She had a cousin in Marsville, 2 towns east, and a general idea of the road that led there. That was enough. It had to be enough. But the road turned muddy fast, and the darkness came down hard, and somewhere between the 3rd and 4th mile marker, she realized she could no longer see her own feet. The lantern she'd grabbed from the porch had gone out in the wind 20 minutes earlier. She was wet through to her collar. Her boots were pulling against the sucking mud with every step, and the night had the particular kind of silence that makes a person feel very alone and very far from anything good. She nearly walked past the house entirely. It appeared through the rain like something half-imagined. A shape at first, a large and dark against the gray sky, then a roofline, then a porch. A house, a real one, with the walls and a door and the promise of dry ground. She didn't know whose it was. In that moment, she didn't care. She pushed through the gate, crossed the yard, climbed the porch steps, and tried the door. It opened. Inside was dark but dry, and she nearly wept from the relief of it. She stood in the doorway long enough to shake the worst of the rain from her coat, then stepped in and pulled the door shut behind her. The room she found herself in was a sitting room of some kind. She could make that much out from the faint light coming through the front window. A stone fireplace on the far wall, a table, 2 chairs, the remains of a fire, still faintly orange in the grate. Someone had been here recently. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself she would dry out, rest an hour, and be gone before first light. No one would ever know she'd been here. She crossed to the fireplace, crouched down, and held her hands toward the warmth of the coals. That was when she heard it. A floorboard. Somewhere behind her and above, the slow, deliberate creak of weight shifting on old wood. Then another. Then the sound of boots on a staircase. Inez did not move. She had grown up in a house where knowing when to stay still was a survival skill. So she stayed still now, hands extended toward a fire that was no longer warming her, and she listened to the footsteps descend the stairs one at a time, unhurried, unafraid, until they reached the bottom and stopped. The silence that followed lasted exactly long enough to be unbearable. "You're in my house." The voice was low, not loud, but not angry exactly, just certain, the way a man is certain when he is standing on his own ground and has no reason to pretend otherwise. Inez turned slowly. He was tall. She registered that first. Then the fact that he was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite place. Not fury, not alarm. Something more measured than either of those things. His hair was dark, pushed back from his face, and there was a stillness about him that she associated with men who had learned a long time ago that raising their voice was a waste of energy. She recognized him then. Not his face. She had never been close enough for that. But the shape of him, the way he stood, the particular quality of the quiet he carried. She had heard his name her whole life spoken in hushed tones across church pews and general store counters. Harley Thornwell. She was standing, dripping rainwater onto the floor of the most feared man in Caldwell Crossing, and he was looking at her like he was genuinely unsure what to do with that fact. Inez straightened her spine. Her voice, when it came, was steadier than she had any right to expect. "I didn't know whose house it was," she said. "I was caught in the rain. I'll leave." She meant it. She was already turning toward the door. "The creek on the south road flooded an hour ago," Harley said. "You won't get far." She stopped. He hadn't moved from the foot of the stairs. He wasn't blocking her way. He wasn't threatening her. He was simply telling her something true, in the same tone a person uses to mention the weather. Inez turned back slowly. She looked at the door. She looked at him. She thought about Hector Baines and her father's fork, set down with such quiet finality, and about how she had walked out into a storm rather than sit still and let her future be handed to someone else. Then she looked at Harley Thornwell again, really looked at him, and found that whatever she had expected to see in the face of a man the whole town feared, it wasn't this. He looked tired, not dangerous, just tired, and alone, and faintly puzzled by the wet, stubborn woman standing in the middle of his sitting room at 10 o'clock at night. "Sit," he said finally. "I'll put some wood on the fire." He said it the way a man says something he's already thought through and decided. Not an invitation, but not a command either. Something in between. Something that left the choice entirely with her. Inez stood there for a moment longer, and then she sat. The fire was rebuilt before either of them said another word. And somewhere in that long, warm silence, something shifted. Something neither of them had a name for yet, and neither of them was quite ready to examine. But it was there. What Inez didn't know, what she couldn't have known sitting in that chair with her wet boots drying by the fire, was why the whole town feared him. And what Harley Thornwell didn't know was that the woman sitting across from him was carrying a secret of her own. One that would reach this house before morning did. Inez woke to the smell of coffee. For a brief, unguarded moment, the kind that exists only in the first few seconds before memory catches up, she didn't know where she was. She was aware of warmth, and the sound of wind outside, and a blanket across her shoulders that she didn't remember pulling there. Then the room settled into focus around her, and everything came back at once. The fire had burned down to a low, steady flame. Gray morning light was pressing through the front window. She was still in the chair. She had fallen asleep sitting up, which told her more about how exhausted she'd been than she cared to admit. The blanket across her shoulders was thick and wool and smelled faintly of cedar. Someone had covered her in the night. She sat with that fact for a moment, unsure what to do with it. From somewhere deeper in the house came the quiet sounds of a kitchen, the dull knock of a pot, the soft rush of water. Inez folded the blanket carefully, set it on the arm of the chair, and stood. Her boots were dry. Her coat, which she had no memory of removing, it was hung over the back of the second chair, facing the fire. She moved toward the kitchen doorway and stopped just short of it. Harley Thornwell was standing at the stove with his back to her, sleeves rolled to the elbow, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups, with the unhurried ease of a man who had done this same thing alone every morning for a very long time. He hadn't heard her yet, or if he had, he gave no sign of it. Inez watched him for a moment, just a moment, before she spoke. "You didn't have to cover me," she said. He didn't startle. He simply set the pot down, picked up both cups, and turned around. "You were shivering," he said, and held one of the cups out to her. She crossed the kitchen and took it. Their fingers didn't touch. She noticed, without meaning to, that he had been careful about that. They drank the coffee standing on opposite sides of the kitchen, which felt like the right amount of distance for 2 strangers who had spent the night under the same roof without meaning to. Outside, the wind had softened. The rain was gone. Through the kitchen window, Inez could see the yard in pale morning light, the fence posts, the empty corral, the long, flat reach of land beyond. "The South Road," she said. "Is it clear yet?" "Might be by mid-morning," Harley said. "Depends on how fast the water moves." She nodded and looked into her cup. She was doing arithmetic in her head. How far to the next town? How long on foot? Whether her cousin in Marsville would ask too many questions, or too few. "Where are you headed?" he asked. It wasn't a demanding question. It carried no edge. But he asked it the same way he'd told her about the flooded creek, like a man who thought information was practical and didn't see the use in withholding it or asking for it rudely. "East," she said. He accepted that without pressing further, and she found herself unexpectedly grateful for it. By the time the sun had fully risen, it was clear the road was not going to be passable by mid-morning. A boy from the nearest farm down the road, no older than 12, riding a mule with the confidence of someone 3 times his age, came by to say the creek had taken out the low bridge overnight. It would be at least 2 days before a wagon could cross, maybe 3. Inez stood on the porch and received this news with the particular stillness of someone who has run out of immediate options and is reorganizing around that fact. That Harley stood beside her, not close, just present. "You can stay," he said, when the boy and his mule had gone. "Until the road clears. There's a spare room upstairs. Door has a bolt on the inside." She looked at him. "I'm telling you that," he said, meeting her eyes. "So you know I'm not asking you to trust me, just offering you a dry place to wait." It was the most words he had strung together since she'd arrived, and there was something in the plainness of them, the complete absence of performance, that made Inez feel unexpectedly steadied. "People will talk," she said. "People already talk," he replied. "About me, anyway. You'd just be new material." There was no bitterness in it. He said it like a man who had long since stopped expecting the world to be otherwise. Inez almost smiled. Almost. All right, she said. 2 days. The first full day passed in a careful, quiet rhythm that surprised her. She had expected awkwardness, the sharp-edged kind that comes from two strangers navigating shared space without a map. Instead, the house seemed to absorb them both without effort. Harley worked outside through most of the morning, repairing a section of fence that the storm had damaged. Inez, unwilling to sit idle, found the kitchen in a state of functional neglect. Nothing dirty, nothing broken, just the accumulated disorder of a man who cooked for survival rather than pleasure, and quietly set about reorganizing it. She told herself it was something to do with her hands. That was all. When Harley came in at midday, he stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at it for a moment without speaking. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said, and set a plate on the table in front of him. He sat down. He ate. He said, after a few minutes, "It's good." It was a simple thing, a very simple thing. But Inez had grown up in a house where a meal placed in front of her father was received as an expectation rather than a gift. And something about the quiet directness of those two words settled somewhere in her chest and stayed there. In the afternoon, she found the bookshelves. They were in a small room off the main hallway, a room she might have taken for a closet if the door hadn't been standing open. Inside were 3 full shelves of books, a lamp, and a chair positioned beneath the window at an angle that caught the afternoon light perfectly. It was so deliberately arranged, so clearly a private space, that she almost backed out without going further. But the titles pulled her in. She was standing there, head tilted sideways, reading spines, when she heard him in the doorway. "Sorry," she said, straightening. "I didn't mean to intrude." "You're not," he said. She looked at him. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms loosely crossed, and there was something in his expression she hadn't seen before. Not quite ease, but the early edge of it. Like a door opened just slightly, not yet wide. "You read a great deal," she said. "When it's quiet," he said, "which is most of the time." She thought about asking him why a man who clearly valued his solitude had the particular reputation he did in Caldwell Crossing. Or she had been wondering about it since last night, the gap between the man the town described and the man who had covered her with a blanket and made her coffee and told her the door had a bolt on the inside so she wouldn't have to worry. She didn't ask. Not yet. Instead, she pulled a book from the shelf, held it up with a questioning look, and he nodded once. She took it to the sitting room. He went back to whatever he'd been doing, and for the rest of the afternoon, the house held them both in that particular comfortable quiet that is rarer and more valuable than most people realize. It was after supper, she had cooked again, and he had not argued, that the question finally found its way into the open. They were sitting on the porch. The evening was cool and clear after the storm, the kind of sky that looks painted, at too many stars to count. Inez had a cup of tea. Harley had nothing, just his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the middle distance. "They say you ran a man out of town," she said. 3 years ago." He didn't tense, didn't shift. "They say a lot of things," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm not asking what they say. I'm asking what happened." A long pause, the kind that isn't evasion, just thought. "Man named Pritchard," Harley said finally. "He was taking water rights from the smaller farms, legal enough on paper, but he'd gotten those signatures through pressure, not agreement. Some of those farmers couldn't read what they were signing." He paused. "I could." Inez looked at him. "I made it difficult for him to stay," Harley said simply. "He left. The farms kept their water." He glanced at her sideways. "Nobody thanked me for it. They just decided I was the kind of man who makes things difficult." The silence that followed was a thoughtful one. "And are you?" Inez said quietly. "The kind of man who makes things difficult." He considered that for a moment with what she was beginning to recognize as his characteristic honesty. "Only for the right people," he said. She should have gone to bed. It was late, and the road might clear by tomorrow, and she had places to be, and a cousin expecting her, and a future to build out of whatever she could carry in a single bag. But she sat on that porch a while longer, and so did he. It was Harley who finally spoke, and what he said was not what she expected. "Your father," he said quietly. Not a question. Not exactly. Inez went still. "You didn't leave because of rain," he said. He wasn't looking at her, and he was still looking at the sky, the same steady way he looked at everything. Nobody packs a bag and walks out in the dark over weather. She didn't answer right away. The words her father had said, "Hector Baines has made an offer. A fair one. I've accepted," sat in her chest like stones. "He arranged a marriage," she said finally, "without asking me. To a man I wouldn't have chosen in 100 years. Harley was quiet for a moment. "And he'll come looking," he said. It wasn't a question this time. Inez felt the truth of it land with a weight she'd been outrunning since last night. "Yes," she said. "He will." The stars were very bright. The night was very still, and somewhere down the dark road that led back toward Caldwell Crossing, a lantern was already moving. She didn't see it, but Harley did. Well, he'd seen it from the porch for the last 10 minutes. The distant, bobbing light of someone who knew exactly where they were going and had no intention of stopping until they got there. He looked at Inez, sitting beside him with her tea gone cold, and her jaw set with the particular quiet courage of a woman who had already made her hardest decision and wasn't going back on it. Then he looked at the lantern again, and he made a decision of his own. Harley stood up from the porch without a word. Inez followed his gaze and saw it then. The lantern, distant but deliberate, moving along the road with the kind of purpose that had nothing to do with coincidence. Her stomach dropped. She knew before she could think it through that it was her father. Gerald Alderton had never in his life let something he considered his simply walk away from him. "Go inside," Harley said quietly. It wasn't a command. It carried none of the weight her father's instructions carried, none of that particular heaviness that said, "because I said so," underneath every word. It was something closer to a request from a man who had already thought 2 steps ahead and was trying to give her time. Inez stood up. She didn't go inside. "I won't hide," she said. Harley looked at her then, really looked at her, and something moved across his face that wasn't quite surprise, but was adjacent to it, like a man recalibrating. "I know," he said. "I wasn't asking you to." He stepped down off the porch and walked to the gate. Inez stayed where she was, on the top step, and watched the lantern grow from a distant flicker into the swinging light of a man on horseback moving at a determined pace up the road. Gerald Alderton pulled his horse to a stop at the gate. He was a broad man, her father. Broad through the shoulders, broad in the way he took up space in a room, as though the air itself owed him accommodation. He looked at Harley Thornwell, standing at his own gate, with the expression of a man who had not expected an obstacle and was deciding how to handle one. Then he looked past Harley at Inez on the porch, and his expression shifted into something harder and more familiar. "Inez," he said, "get your things." She had heard that voice her entire life. It had pulled her back from 100 small rebellions. A word left unsaid. A door closed softly instead of firmly. A dress worn that he hadn't approved of. And every time she had listened, something inside her had gone a little quieter. She felt the pull of it now, old and deep and entirely automatic. But she stayed where she was. "No," she said. The word was so simple, so short. It surprised even her. Not that she'd thought it, but that it had come out whole and clear and without apology attached to it. Gerald's eyes moved back to Harley. "This is none of your business, Thornwell." "She's on my property," Harley said. His voice was even. No performance in it. No aggression. Just a plain statement of geography. "That makes it somewhat my business." "She's my daughter." "She's a grown woman," Harley said, "who walked out of your house of her own choosing." Gerald shifted in his saddle. He was the kind of man who was accustomed to silencing people with his presence alone, and Harley Thornwell was not being silenced, which was visibly disorienting. "Hector Baines is a good man," Gerald said, "at changing angles. He'll provide for her, give her a proper life." "A proper life," Inez said from the porch, "is not the same thing as a chosen one." Her father looked at her. In his eyes was something she had spent years trying to read correctly, a mix of genuine belief in his own righteousness and a frustration he'd never quite learned to separate from affection. He did love her, in the way that some men love the things they own. She had always known that. It had never made it easier. "You're being foolish," he said. "Maybe," she said, "but I'm being foolish on my own terms." The conversation that followed was not a short one. Gerald argued the way he always argued, circling, returning, restating the same position from different angles, as though eventually one of them would land. Harley stood at the gate and said almost nothing, which turned out to be more effective than anything he could have said, because Gerald could not intimidate a silence. He needed resistance to push against, and Harley simply wouldn't provide it. It was close to an hour before Gerald Alderton finally accepted that he was not leaving with what he'd come for. He looked at his daughter one last time. Something in his face shifted, not into warmth exactly, but into a reluctant acknowledgement that the thing he was looking at was no longer entirely his to direct. "This isn't finished," he said. "It is for tonight," Inez replied. He turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come, the lantern swinging with the rhythm of the animal's movement, until it disappeared around the bend in the road, and the dark settled back in, quiet and complete. Inez let out a breath she had been holding for what felt like several minutes. Harley came back up the porch steps and stood beside her, both of them looking out at the empty road. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him sideways. "That seems to be a habit of yours." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one, the shape of it just beneath the surface. "Go get some sleep," he said. "Road should be clear by morning." She didn't sleep for a long time. She lay in the spare room with the bolt drawn and the window open slightly to the cool night air, and she looked at the ceiling and thought about choices, the ones made for you, the ones you make in desperation, and the ones you don't quite realize you're making until you're already in the middle of them. But she thought about a man who had stood at his own gate for an hour in the dark, on behalf of a woman he'd known for less than 2 days. Not because she had asked him to. Not because he had anything to gain from it. Simply because she was on his property, and she had said no, and he thought that ought to mean something. She thought about the blanket across her shoulders in the night, the coffee in 2 cups. The door has a bolt on the inside. Sleep came eventually. It came easier than it had any right to. In the morning, the road was clear. Inez came downstairs with her bag packed and her coat on, prepared to say a practical and dignified goodbye to a man she would likely never see again. She found Harley at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee already poured, and a look on his face that suggested he had been sitting there thinking for a while before she came down. "Sit," he said, "before you go." She sat. He wrapped both hands around his cup and looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at her. I'm not going to ask you to stay, he said. That's not what this is. All right, she said, carefully. But I'd like to know. He stopped, started again, more deliberately. Your cousin in Marsville. Is that where you want to go, or just where you figured you could go? Inez opened her mouth, closed it again. It was such a precise question. The difference between those two things, wanting and settling, was something she had been navigating her entire life, and no one had ever put it that plainly before. I don't know, she admitted. Harley nodded slowly, not like a man receiving information he'd half expected. There's work here, he said. If you wanted it. The books need keeping. I'm good with land and livestock, but numbers give me trouble. It would be a fair arrangement, separate and proper. He met her eyes. No obligation past what you agreed to. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a bird was doing something uncomplicated and cheerful in the yard. You're offering me employment, Inez said slowly. I'm offering you a choice, Harley said. A real one, not one someone else made for you. She stayed. Not because she had nowhere else to go. She had turned that excuse over carefully and found it wasn't true enough to hide behind. She stayed because when she picked up her bag and walked to the door and stood there for a moment looking out at the morning, yet she found that the pull she felt was not toward the road. The arrangement was exactly what he had said it would be, separate and proper, and fair in the way that only things freely agreed to can be fair. She kept the books. She managed the household accounts with a precision that Harley acknowledged with a kind of quiet approval that she found, to her own surprise, she valued more than elaborate praise. The weeks passed in the same unhurried rhythm as those first 2 days, and slowly, so slowly, that neither of them could have pointed to the moment it shifted. The careful distance between them became something else. Not smaller exactly, just warmer. The way a room warms when the fire has been going long enough that you forget it was ever cold. He began to ask her opinion on things. She began to offer it, without waiting to be asked. Now they argued once, productively, about whether the east pasture was worth the cost of fencing, and Inez turned out to be right, which Harley acknowledged without ceremony and without resentment, which she found more attractive than she was immediately prepared to deal with. She wrote to her cousin in Marsville and explained in careful and not entirely complete terms that her plans had changed. Her father did not come back. It was a Tuesday in late December, ordinary in every way except that it wasn't, when Harley came in from the cold with his hat in his hands and stood in the kitchen doorway looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not uncertainty, exactly, but the edge of it. There's something I want to say, he said. Inez set down what she was doing and gave him her full attention. But he was quiet for a moment. Then, I don't think I was living before you came here. I was just occupying the place. He said it simply, without drama, looking at her the way he looked at everything, directly and without evasion. I don't want to go back to that. The kitchen held the words. Inez looked at this man who had covered her with a blanket without waking her, who had stood at a gate in the dark for an hour without being asked, who had offered her a choice when no one else in her life had thought to, and she felt something settle in her chest with the finality of something that has found the place it belongs. Then don't, she said. They were married in the spring. Not a large wedding. Neither of them wanted that. A small ceremony in the parlor of the house that had ceased, somewhere in the months between October and April, as to be only his. The minister from town came out, and 2 neighbors served as witnesses, and when it was done, Harley took her hand in his, the way he did everything, quietly and with complete intention, and did not let it go. The town of Caldwell Crossing talked about it for approximately 2 weeks. Then they found other things to talk about, as towns always do. Harley and Inez Thornwell did not particularly notice. They had a pasture to fence, books to keep, and a life to build out of the particular combination of 2 people who had each, in their own way, been waiting without knowing what they were waiting for. By the following winter, there was a cradle in the spare room. The bolt on the inside of the door had not been turned in months. Some things begin in desperation and become the truest thing you ever found. Some doors you walk through in the dark turn out to lead exactly where you needed to go. Inez Alderton had run from a future she hadn't chosen and stepped, wet and shivering, and entirely by accident, into the only one she ever wanted. If you find yourself drawn to stories like this one, quiet and warm and human, there are more waiting for you here. No rush. They'll keep.